So tell us also about the Central Park 5 story, because that also is recounted in your book.
Yeah, so that's I think, really Donald Trump's first, that's the moment that he kind of enters the culture war. That's the moment that he becomes like an actual kind of political person. Until then, and just to briefly recap, what happens is a young woman is raped and beaten unconscious and nearly murdered in Central Park in the late spring of 1989. Some suspects are very quickly rounded up. 5 black, like black and Hispanic kids from Harlem are rounded up, are immediately charged, and are basically publicly convicted. Literally in a matter of days, even hours, and so the city is at least part of the city is like really kind of calling for blood. And even as some people, particularly like a group of black leaders, are saying, like, hold on a second here. What's the evidence? Can we at least have a trial first? Even David Dinkins, who was running for mayor at the time and was trying to prove that he was going to be tough on crime, but at the same time was like, wait, well, let's, innocent until proven guilty here. But nevertheless, there's a real kind of sense of bloodlust in the city. Trump sees that, takes out a full-page ad in all of the daily papers calling for these 5 kids to be executed. And it's both a kind of, Trump playing into this desire for vengeance, and it's also a way for him to kind of criticize Koch, his old nemesis, and his management of the city. But it's this kind of shocking. People were sort of surprised. Well, what is Donald Trump doing, kind of weighing in on like this like on a kind of legal case like this? He's a businessman,
right?
So it's the first kind of moment, and a couple of the tabloid columnists, Jimmy Breslin for one, was kind of appalled, couldn't believe that Trump was doing this. But it's sort of the first moment that he kind of wades into the culture war, wades into politics in a kind of meaningful and polarizing, and very importantly, obviously, polarizing way.
It's also, again, it's hard to remember quite how dramatic that crime was. I was living in London at the time, and I remember hearing about it. A woman who'd gone jogging in Central Park, which was supposed to be the most sacred of places.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it was this astonishingly violent crime too.
Yeah.
So how did it all play out? We know they weren't guilty, for which he's shown no remorse whatsoever for accusing them falsely.
No, they would all be. So there was no physical evidence. It's amazing. They were convicted without any physical evidence, and they were later, many years later, exonerated. The city went back and reinvestigated the case, and look, another kind of culprit was like the actual culprit was found. It wasn't even like, well, it wasn't them, but the crime is still unsolved. It was, it's very clearly another person who had committed some rapes even before the Central Park jogger.
Right.
So, but you're right. It was a huge national story, and it's also another reason why it had such resonance is that there was another crime just a couple of years earlier, also in Central Park, another huge tabloid story known as the Preppy murder.
Oh, yeah, I remember that story too.
Yeah, so that,
what's
of course,
going on in New York? Why is it so crazy violent? Exactly.
Another young woman who was, this woman was actually, Jennifer Levin, was actually killed in Central Park, by, as it turned out, by a guy who was, she was sort of her boyfriend, and so this, and it was the same prosecutor, Linda Fairstein, who was from the district attorney's office, who did both cases. So I think part of the reason why the Central Park jogger case had such kind of resonance was that there had been the Preppy murder also in the park just a couple years earlier. So there was this sense that the city was kind of building towards something even more tragic.
Right. It's fascinating. fascinating. And where was Rudy Giuliani in all this? Because obviously he emerges a few years later as New York's mayor.
Yeah.
But what's he doing at this point? As Donald Trump is laying the seeds for what becomes his extraordinary political dominance, what is Rudy doing?
Yeah, so Rudy is the U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York. So basically, he is the chief prosecutor, the chief federal prosecutor in New York, and he is. It's really where Rudy, I mean, this is where we see Rudy kind of build his reputation for the first time. He sort of presents himself as this kind of morally righteous, the prosecutor who could have been a priest. He had thought about going into the priesthood, he liked to say. Yeah. And then he goes after the mob. He goes after a lot of kind of bold-faced names in New York: Leona Helmsley, Imelda Marcos. He goes after Koch and sort of city corruption. And he's the office of the U.S. Attorney in the Southern District is kind of a legendary position. Has produced a lot of Supreme Court justices, governors, et cetera. But it's always there's an approach to the job, which is, it's you try to be understated. You win your cases in the courtroom, not in the public. Mm-hmm. Rudy kind of turned that completely on its head, had a press conference every time he made an arrest, was issuing press releases, was sort of doing everything he could to bring as much attention to himself as possible. Interestingly, this is kind of a crazy thing to think about now. So Rudy then decides to run for mayor. So he runs first in 1989 and loses. Then he obviously goes on to become mayor 4 years later. But in 1989, he decides he's going to run for mayor. And Donald Trump wants to support him. Trump wants to, as I've said, he has this ongoing feud with Koch. He wants to see Koch lose. So he gets behind Rudy. And then the Central Park 5 case happens, and Trump takes out that ad, and suddenly he becomes this, very polarizing figure. Rudy is having a big fundraiser at the Plaza Hotel, and he's already put Donald Trump on the kind of fundraising committee. It's too late for him to kick him off, but he's concerned that I don't want to be seen with Donald Trump. He's now this polarizing guy in the city. He called for the execution of these 5 black kids, and so Rudy's press people kind of get together before the fundraiser, and they say, well, we can't kick Trump out, but we got to make sure that Rudy's doesn't get his picture taken with Donald Trump.
Oh, how hilarious. Wow. The tiny little vignettes which just drip, drip, drip up to where we are now. It's just fascinating to hear the roots of what we're seeing now writ large. I read that you decided to write the book because you covered the Trump campaign in 2016 and decided to go back and try and understand where he came from. Is that right?
Yeah. So I was assigned to the campaign in 2016 at the Times where I work, but I wasn't covering candidates. I was just sort of writing longer stories about kind of digging back into some of the candidates' past. And because I had written a book about New York in the 1970s called Ladies and Gentlemen, The Bronx is Burning, I was sort of a journalist and a New York historian, I guess you could say. And so I was kind of gravitated toward Trump in the 80s, and I wrote a piece about his relationship with Roy Cohn. I wrote a piece about the Justice Department's lawsuit against him and his father for refusing to rent apartments to black people. And I just kind of got interested in, I didn't want to write a book about Trump, but I got interested in that whole period of time, which, was his crucible, but it also was just a crazy time in the life of New York City, and a kind of transformative time. It's when the city really kind of shifted its access from the kind of working class to Wall Street, and to sort of finance and real estate. And so really when it became the modern city, that kind of happened in the 1980s. So I kind of discovered that it was like a really interesting lens to see the city's kind of evolution through.
And it's a bit like a non-fiction version of, I was thinking of there's been so many good novels written about that time. I mean, Bright Lights, Big City by Jay McInerney, Tom Wolfe's The Bonfire of the Vanities. This feels a little bit like a non-fiction vanity.
Yes, that is
Bonfire of the Vanities.
Exactly. That is like how I often will characterize it, as the non-fiction Bonfire of the Vanities.
Which is irresistible.
Yeah,
I couldn't put that book down. When Bonfire of the Vanities came out, I was actually on safari in Africa. I was being driven around, and there were all these incredible animals, and all I did was have my nose in that book. And also the movie Wall Street too, which was again the books that were huge. Well, books and movies, culture, are hugely important for setting a new version of New York in the global imagination.
Exactly, and that's I mean, Wall Street. Yes, another very good example. And of course, the sort of the famous kind of greed is good. Gordon Gekko, borrowed from Ivan Boesky. That is the kind of the birth of like the modern Wall Street, of the birth, in this, and that is where that's and Trump in many ways really sort of still embodies that. He is the personification of 1980s excess and wealth, which is so crazy because he's also paradoxically somehow fashioned himself into the voice of those who were left out and the disaffected. And it's sort of like, what a crazy political magic trick that you can be both the great symbol of 1980s excess.
I mean, he still looks like that, like the oversized suits, the long tie. He's walked straight out of a movie about the 1980s.